Having switched on the microphone, I will now be deeply professional, but I did wonder whether today's agenda might go through more quickly than others, but we will take the appropriate amount of time to deal with all the important matters in front of us. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Candlish. I'm the Cabinet Member of Transport, and this is a transport decision-making meeting. There are some formalities we have to go before the meeting starts. I'm going to start with some housekeeping information for the people in the room. If the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and the public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts and assemble at the Queen Victoria statue in Guildhall Square. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust Fire Marshal regulations, anyone who's signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. Please can everyone use the microphones and remember to switch them off when they have finished, otherwise the camera will remain on you. Everyone speaking will be on camera, apart from those on my right. Please could everyone ensure that they speak directly into the microphone to ensure that the audio is clear on the live web stream. Okay. First order of business is some introductions. So I've introduced myself. I would like to ask the councillors to introduce themselves.
Councillor Simon Bowshire, I'm the Conservative spokesman for Transport.
I'm Councillor Graham Heaney and I'm the Labour spokesman for Transport.
Councillor Lee Tyndall, the Reform for Transport. Thank you.
Alison Harper, Democratic Services.
Barbara Thomas, TRO Team Lead.
Michael Thomas, EV and TRO Delivery Lead.
Richard Pemberton, Transport Strategy Team Leader.
Daniel Oates, Parking Enforcement Manager.
Kevin McKee, Senior Advisor on Parking.
Lisa Cook, Head of Transport Operations.
Felicity Tidbury, Assistant Director for Transport.
Hayley Chivers, Transport Planning Manager.
Oliver Taverner, Principal Transport Planner.
Gareth James, Transport Strategy Team Leader.
And we've now got some people who will be making some deputations during the course of this meeting, and they are...
Councillor Carlyman for Copner.
Councillor Darren Sanders for Baffins.
Councillor Abdul Qadir, Baffins, just to be here to see it.
Ben Sharp, Exeter Road.
Thank you very much. So, we've done introductions. I am not aware of there being any apologies. We've got a full suite of people in today. Are there any declarations of interest from anyone? Councillor Heaney.
Yes, I just need to declare that I live in one of those zones that's being considered a possible RPZ later in the report, but I don't think it's a substantial interest, and I'm not making the decision, so I think you just need to be aware of that.
Thank you, and I'm going to declare that I'm actually, I was featured in one of the objections that comes through in this meeting, but again, I don't think it is prejudicial to my conduct of this decision-making meeting. Okay. That's introductions, apologies and declaration of interest. So we're going to move to the agenda now. We generally try to make it easier for residents who come in and make deputations. I'm going to make a small change to the order and suggest that we start with what is item 4 on the agenda, which is the Exeter Road EV Bay, if that's okay with everyone. I'm going to take that as concurrence, and I'm now going to ask Mike to provide an initial presentation.
Thank you very much. So this report is for the Exeter Road EV Bay Electric Vehicle Recharging Places number 6, reference P004-2026. And this is to consider changing the traffic regulation or restriction of an RPZ bay to a single EV recharging bay in Exeter Road. This location was previously consulted upon as part of Batch 4 of the AUX programme for 56 bays. All 56 bays were consulted upon at the same time, including this location. However, the Exeter Road location had the road name transposed with Festing Grove on the notice placed on site. This original consultation received 2 objections to the initial consultation and the error was questioned by the public, and given this, it was deemed reasonable to ensure this location was undertaken with the correct information. So the subsequent statutory consultation took place between the 20th of February and the 13th of March 2026. 4 new objections were received as part of the second consultation. All objections can be found in Appendix A of the report and are summarised and discussed in Section 6, page 3 of this report. And the objections received were in line with those received as previous ORC scheme in the previous 5 batches. Given that, the recommendation is for the Cabinet to approve the TRO report reference P004-2026 Extra Road Recharging Bay.
Thank you very much. The way we will do things today is that after we've had initial presentation of a report, we're going to have any resident deputations, any other deputations from councillors, and then the floor, as it were, will be open to the councillors here to ask any questions they have, seek any clarifications, then to make any comments, and then finally it's down to me as the Transport Cabinet member to make a final decision. So, Mr. Sharp, you have the floor now to make a deputation on the matter, and you've got about 6 minutes, something like that.
Thank you. I wish to formally object to the proposal for an electric vehicle charging point on Exeter Road. This is not the first time I've shared my views on the matter, and I registered them in a previous objection. In my eyes, this process has been defined by a total failure of procedural transparency and a disregard for the voices of those who actually live in the area. The initial consultation for the site was fundamentally flawed. The proposal space was incorrectly advertised, a fact that was clear from the outset and is acknowledged in the new report. I raised this error in my formal written objection, yet at the subsequent meeting, the Chair stated on record that he had gone through the reports carefully before proceeding with the approval. I have slight concerns that when I spoke with my ward councillor at a drop-in session on the 15th of November, he expressed complete surprise at the issue I'd already documented and registered for this meeting. My concern being that how can the proposal be carefully reviewed if the basic written objection regarding the location were either ignored or not fully understood by the decision maker. Following that interaction, I've engaged in mostly one-way correspondence with the councillor and my ward councillor to resolve these errors, eventually receiving a clear acknowledgement of the issue and, most importantly, a promise that installation would not proceed until a proper, lawful reconsultation had taken place. Unfortunately, that promise was broken, and despite the assurance that work would be paused, the installation was pushed through in mid-December of last year. In my mind, this was not an administrative oversight. It was a deliberate act taken in defiance of the commitment made to a resident of that ward. We're now looking at the results of a subsequent reconsultation. 100% of the residents who responded, every single one of them, has objected to this installation. If the council's purpose really is to represent the ward, you have your answer. You've claimed this site was chosen at the request of residents, yet despite repeated requests, no one has been able to produce a single resident of the street or area who has submitted support in writing for this EV charge point. I note in the previous Cabinet meeting you acknowledged the spaces offer a service for a wider area than just our street. Presumably this is the same area that you've requested objections and put support from in this second consultation period. Again, this area has only objected. You're imposing infrastructure that the local community does not want, supported by councillors who do not live with the consequences. I believe the motivation for this rush becomes clear when you look at the language used in the initial proposal. The document explicitly stated that any locations not implemented by the funding deadline would be removed from the scheme entirely. It is my opinion that the department knew this. They've prioritised installation and meeting a funding deadline over the democratic requirement for a fair consultation of the initial placement of the space. They've chosen to ignore the errors, ignore the council promises, and ignore the residents, simply to ensure the concrete was poured before the deadline and money expired. I'm even more cynical to now see the submission argues that the project should proceed because, and I quote, the infrastructure is already installed and therefore it has no further impact on energy and waste. The report claims we're now simply aiming to restrict non-electric car use. If the agreed process occurred, this wouldn't be an option, and you're effectively using your own previous procedural breaches as a justification for why it should be allowed to stay. That's circular and, in my opinion, poor governance. And this is a question of accountability. You're here to serve the area and the ward, and today you have the opportunity to correct the wrongs, restore the integrity of the consultation process, and listen to the residents you'll represent. I request you reject this proposal, remove the unauthorised infrastructure that's been put in, and respect the reviews of the residents who live in your ward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sharp. Any questions from the councillors? Any comments? Mike?
Yeah, just to come back in. The infrastructure itself, which is the charging unit, does not require any permissions as such. That can be implemented by us as the Highway Authority. This report is actually on the objections received to the TRO itself. Whichever decision made, we will act accordingly. But this report is for the decision of the traffic regulation order, not the charging infrastructure.
Thank you. Okay, if there are no questions or comment, Councillor Tyndall, sorry.
Just to follow up on follow up on that question. So can I just confirm that the actual EV charging infrastructure did go through the lawful process before?
There's no lawful process as such for it. This legislation is specifically for under the Road Traffic Regulation Act for the traffic regulation order. So as the Highway Authority, we can implement the EV infrastructure itself. It's the order that has to follow the legislative process.
Any further questions or comments?
Just one. I thought that the clarification I sort of becoming a bit clearer is that what the situation is that the only thing that the TRO does is to provide a protected space for the EV charging point, i.e. preventing ordinary residents parking. If it wasn't there, then anyone could park there, but the EV charging point wouldn't disappear. That's correct, is it?
So if I take that one on now as part of my kind of wrap-up, the reality now, to answer the question which is kind of on the table somehow, is that there is now EV infrastructure actually installed upon the road. It is marked up, there is an EV bay there, and therefore we have to decide what we are going to do in that situation. If I rewind now, I think it has been clearly acknowledged that a mistake was made in the original documentation that went up on the street. There was a transposition of the names of the roads. It is an open question how much that caused confusion or restricted the ability of people to respond. But it is absolutely true, two things, that all of the people who did respond were objectors to it, and secondly, that the mistake was made. There is a statement that the infrastructure was forced through, which I would say is not my perception of it. So the timing of the revelation of the mistake, working it through the system to discover what had happened and why, overlaid with the timing with which the materials were installed. So we then ended up with a situation in which materials had been installed, but an objection had been, or an error in the process had been identified. So that I have to say we have to take on the chin. What we're faced with now are two decisions. Firstly, is there so the report is basically seeking to regularise the situation and give permission to the space that is in there, and the decision there relates back to the objections, because the consultation was rerun to enable anyone who had felt themselves misguided in the first place to be able to come forward and object to the scheme. There was a... Councillor Bosher?
Sorry, Councillor, I'm probably being a bit of a pedant here. What we're saying is that the TRO notification that went out to the public was incorrect. Has that been rectified, or are you facing a decision based on what was essentially incorrect information? As I understand it, the whole process is a legal process of which the TRO is a legal document in that. And my argument would be that if the information that was put out to the public on which the consultation was based was incorrect, then how can you make a decision to go with a recommendation?
So you are correct, and therefore the decision was made to completely rerun the consultation. So a whole new consultation process was run. The people who had responded initially were advised that the process was being rerun, and we ended up with the objections that we have now got. In fact, that generated a couple more objections to the process. The point that came up through the deputation and is in the report is that we actually have also the reality that the infrastructure is actually already constructed in the road. That is not ideal, but that is where we are at the moment. So, firstly, let us make the decision about the TRO. I do read the objections and I understand them, and these are basically, the objections are around two areas. One is around objecting to the space, and the second is around the error in the process. So on the second one, whilst acknowledging it, it has been rerun. I think that one I'm now going to put to one side. I'm happy that an adequate presentation to the public has been made for them to make a reasonable decision, and for me to make a reasonable decision on the evidence that they have given back. On the first one around the objections, this is very similar to the very large number of comments that we got back through the wider process of the EV scheme. Essentially, the objections are relating to parking as opposed to either the technical safety of the position or to the technical possibility of the place, and also the safety of the locations chosen. I'm happy that this is a suitable place to be putting an EV charge point, and although I recognise that there is some objections in the community from this, I have been consistent throughout this that we're looking this on as the 15-year piece of infrastructure. The evidence is that the site is already being used, so I am confident there is a need for it, and that is only going to be rising, and therefore I'm happy to make a decision based on this report that I'm happy to accept the recommendation in this report and regularise or go through with the TRO as it is in front of us, which will lead us to have the EV bay in operation on Exeter Road as it currently is. Okay, that's the end of that item. I'm now going to move back to the agenda. Sorry, we changed the agenda on this, didn't we? So I'm now going to move to what was item number 3 on the agenda, proposed time-limited parking place in New Road. And Gareth James, you're up to talk to this one, please.
Thank you. So yes, this is a report to consider objections to a proposed time-limited parking place in New Road. Just before getting into the report, I'd just like to correct something on at the very start, that it says the ward affected is Nelson, whereas the eagle-eyed amongst you may have already picked up that that should, of course, say Fratton. So apologies for that error. So moving on to the recommendations, it's recommended that the Cabinet Member for Transport approves the time-limited parking place as advertised on New Road. So some background to this. Following objections to the GD Residence Parking Zone scheme, which was approved at the September 2025 Cabinet Member for Transport meeting and was implemented in March this year, stakeholder engagement was undertaken with local businesses along the impacted section of New Road. As a result of that engagement, to support customer visits, it's been decided to propose a time-limited parking bay on the north side of New Road, east of the junction of New Road and Northgate Avenue, and eastwards for 15 metres from the end of the double yellow lines. The limited wait period would be 1 hour with no return within 1 hour, operating from 8 AM to 6 PM, Monday to Saturday. So the consultation on that proposal was advertised on the 23rd of January 2026 through a traffic order. There were 4 objections submitted by local residents who expressed concern that the bay would be excluded from the GD residents parking zone scheme, potentially leading to a reduction in available parking for those living in the area. Those representations can be found in full in Appendix B to the report. So the reason for our recommendation is that introducing a time-limited parking bay as proposed would allow short-term parking for visitors of the nearby shops, the cemetery and other purposes during the day, and it would enable residential overnight parking. All the objections were carefully considered alongside the rationale for proposing the time-limited bay. Having taken all perspectives into account, on balance and in professional judgment, the net potential benefits to local retail and amenities justify taking the proposal forward, so it's therefore considered that no amendments are required. Thank you.
I don't think we've got any deputations to this one, so we're straight into any questions from councillors. Any comments? Okay, let me summarise where I am on this one. So, big picture, the introduction of the GD Fratton zone has settled in well. However, there were issues and objections that arose from that. And I think what has come up with, I think it is in 5.3, on balance and in professional judgment, the net potential benefits to local retail and amenities justify taking the proposal forward. So once again, this is going to result in a small reduction in the unrestricted parking spaces available in an area which suffers from very strong parking pressures. So it's not something that is done lightly. However, it is still going to enable overnight parking for cars, which is the primary reason. It is helping have parking available for local businesses, for visitors to nearby amenities like the cemetery, and by having limited time parking, it's actually going to encourage turnover of vehicles through there. So I think this is a reasonable balance to be taking. I'm therefore happy to accept the recommendation as presented and move to the next item. So the next item on the agenda is around residential parking zones. And that has a Mr. Fryer coming to make a deputation, but I haven't seen Mr. Fryer arrive. So we're going to go straight in now to the presentation by Gareth James.
Yeah, thank you. Just loading up the right report. So the purpose of this report is to provide an update on the delivery of the current programme of consultation on residence parking zones, also referred to as RPZs, and to seek approval for the future programme. The recommendation is that the Cabinet Member for Transport approves the RPZ future programme for proposed new zones and review of existing zones as set out in section 5 of the report. And also delegates authority to the Assistant Director for Economy, Transport and Planning in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Transport to prioritise the zones set out in paragraphs 5.1 and 5.2. So just to provide the background to this report, the Council regularly receives requests for residence parking zones which can help residents park closer to home. Requests are considered based on councillor and resident feedback, particularly in areas with high demand where commuters, visitors or nearby facilities reduce on-street parking available for local residents. Potential RPZs are first assessed through informal resident surveys. If support is positive, then a formal scheme is developed and subsequently consulted on through the traffic regulation order process. Final decisions are made by the Cabinet Member for Transport, with the full process to implementation usually taking around 18 months. The current programme, so that's nearing completion, and Table 1 of the report provides an update for each of the 7 RPZs that were included, noting that only the AB zone extension, that's Wimmering Lane, remains to be concluded, and that's now progressing to formal consultation. So moving on to the proposed future programme, that has been informed by residents and councillor inquiries, as well as related factors such as neighbouring zone implementation, and new zones are generally given priority over reviews of existing zones. So the initial focus would be on Baffins Ward, which is likely to be split into two zones due to the size and implemented by summer 2028 if progressed. Parts of Copner, Nelson and Hilsea also received high levels of requests, and the proposed zones for those areas is shown in Appendix A. The remaining programme will be prioritised at regular intervals as set out in Table 2, allowing flexibility to bring forward other areas if circumstances change. The programme also includes reviews of existing zones KC, MD and MH, with KC a high priority due to significant changes since its introduction back in 2004. These reviews require similar resources to new schemes and will be scheduled alongside the wider programme. Consultation will take an holistic approach, considering private vehicle parking alongside demand for complementary measures such as cycle parking and car club bays, in line with the transport strategy and the Council's adopted parking strategy. So to summarise, residents' parking zones help people park closer to their homes, especially in areas with limited off-street parking. They support fairer use of curbside space, reduce local parking challenges, and respond to clear resident and councillor concerns. The programme outlined in the report sets out a practical way to meet demand for RPZs, completing the current programme by summer 2027 and prioritising future work in line with community needs, legal requirements and available resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. I suspect residential parking zones will cause more debate and discussion than any other item on today's agenda, but we will see. Councillor Inman, are you ready to make your deputation?
Yes, Chair, thank you. When I was first elected back in May, the GD parking zone had just gone live. The effect on this new parking zone was to push more vehicles, cars and vans, into a Copner area, and then this became the first area as you came to when travelling north of the city without any residents parking. This then led to many residents contacting myself about the issues they were and still are experiencing. I did send yourself an email in which you explained that nobody had ever asked Copner to be considered for parking permits, but as it was now next to a new GD zone, it would be added to the list. I'm therefore confused as to why only 30% of Copner has been added to the latest areas to be considered. Going from Powers Court Road to Stubbington Road only will push more vehicles into the Mayfield area, where there are already issues, especially around school drop-off and collection times. I would ask that you include the whole ward to be considered for consultation. Talking to the residents, it's a very mixed bag of people for and against such a scheme. Some residents are afraid that they won't be able to afford the scheme. I would like to take the opportunity to assure residents that there will be a consultation, and if a majority of the people don't want it, it won't happen. However, I doubt very much if the council will reverse all, if any of the existing zones, as some would also like. The area to the east of Copner, but excluding Anchorage Park, already suffers greatly with parking. Residents have been reporting issues to me of them struggling to find parking within a mile of their house most nights. I believe this scheme may help improve their lives. Parking in the majority of Copner area, whilst it's been far from perfect, especially around the Mayfield Road area, has now become awful since the introduction of the JD zone to the south of it. The partial extension, rather than a full ward consultation, I believe is necessary to prevent further issues to the residents of all of Copner. If you don't include the whole ward, then it could be another 3 years before all the residents get a resident parking permit scheme. Finally, in your email, you did say that you doubted this will be our last conversation about parking, and that parking was a favourite topic for residents. I have to say, this is one thing I think we can both agree on. Thank you.
Thank you, and we certainly can. Councillor Sanders.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just to start with, I do have to do a personal but not prejudicial interest, which is that I live in the zone, the central Baffin zone, as does Councillor Heaney, that is proposed for consultation. However, that does not affect what I'm about to say. Since I got elected 14 years ago, one topic has come up in the thousands of conversations I've had with people in Baffins more than any other, and it's basically people who are struggling to park in the area. You know, Councillor Candlish, and indeed Mr James has raised it in his presentation. The Baffins ward councillors and Baffins residents have been reflecting that concern to this council pretty much ever since. Their and our frustration is understandable. 18 years ago, the whole area was surveyed. 3 respondents in 5 backed the idea of having parking permits in principle. Some roads didn't, but 3 in 5 residents did. If the current rules had been in place then, we would have seen permits in our area years ago. But instead, only a few roads got them. This led to the resentment I mentioned earlier, and people asking when are they coming in. Indeed, I had one of them in my surgery only last Monday. So today, after 18 years, we're here again. I, for one, am delighted about that, but I'm older and wiser, and so are my residents. So here is my shopping list to try and make sure that we can generate as much trust as we can in the area and deliver something that will work and meet the needs of local people. And my first item the first item on my list actually doesn't concern Central Baffins at all. My ward covers some of the roads around Copner Bridge, some of which have permits, some of which are very close to Councillor Inman's ward. And as with Councillor Inman, they haven't come to me. We've gone to them. Councillor Kadir and I have gone to the people affected in the area who are facing displacement from the GD zone, and they're saying very clearly that displacement is happening. They want to know when it will be fixed, and so do I. I hope that we can have an indicative timetable of when action will be taken. I know about capacity issues. I know of the demands, not least of what might be coming with local government reorganisation and the impact on the team of the combined authority as well. But I think it's owed to Copner residents to have a reasonable idea at some stage of when the parking pressures that they face can be dealt with. I note that Councillor Inman has asked to include the whole Copner ward in a review of parking. Unfortunately, that's great for him, but it does not include those Copner residents that live in the ward that Councillor Kadir and I represent. And I hope that we can have action soon. I hope to see it. I hope we can make some progress on that this afternoon, and we can offer some reassurance. I think the next stage with the area that will be surveyed is to do things differently. We should involve residents much more in the design of zones and also be straight with them on what all this actually means. Councillor Candlish, you know I've been saying this to you pretty much since you took on this role, so this is not news to you, but I think nonetheless it is important. So we'll start with the in-principle survey. Now, one of the reasons doing this in my ward is hard, and I suspect one of the reasons why this has not been touched until now, is because people split. Many want permits very badly. Others either see them as infringing their freedom to have as many cars as they like and park them where they want, or see them as another tax when they pay loads of tax already. That's why it's crucial to be straight up front on what permits can and can't do. Then any decision that is taken is done with people's eyes open, not blinded. Now, we may have a muddy outcome, either as happened 18 years ago, most people saying yes, but some roads saying no, or the other way around. Now, some people have told me what they want to see happening at that. If most vote no, they say that roads that vote yes should be ignored. While if most people vote yes and some roads say no, some people say to me those roads that say no should not have permits at all. So trying to balance that up, trying to balance up the practicalities of zones with the reality people face may well require doing things differently around any zones that emerge, and if any zones emerge, I would want the council to work with residents and councils on specific options. And that may mean some hard choices for all of us. It also will mean looking at other issues that relate to all this as well. People accept Portsmouth has too many cars, not enough island, and everyone else's vehicle should be removed. Plenty tell me their sons and daughters, for instance, live with them because they can't afford a home. But that means more cars on the streets. What's being proposed here cannot solve these structural issues, but what I want is the council and local people to work together to look at all options. Councillor Kadir, Councillor Oliver and I have asked those people who think parking is a problem but don't want permits to provide alternatives. I think the council should do too. So here are a few, provided by one of my residents, a lady called Jem Ballock, on social media. So she has suggested, instead of permits, a TRO that restricts caravans parking, a TRO to stop vehicles of a certain size parking overnight, cancel vehicles parked overnight in lockups rather than on employees' roads, something that I think other local people want extended to the private sector, and finally painted parking bays outside people's houses. Now I assume all these restrictions will include Baffin's residents as well, but it'd be good to know if these are illegal or pose practical problems. In the meantime, I want to thank Jen for her suggestions. Now, we live in a democracy, so the council, I'm sure, will, and certainly we will, accept the outcome of any vote, either in principle or in detail. We did this when residents in our side of Cotton said no to permits a few years ago and defended that when they then complained why nothing had happened. What is clear is that we cannot wait another 18 years for action. That's why I welcome this proposal for Baffins today, but would like a timetable for my Cotton residents and urge this council to do things differently so that we can work together and people aren't blinded again. Thank you. Peter.
Thank you very much. Councillors, any questions?
Thank you very much. I think the officers might well be aware of the question I'm going to ask, and I think you might well have actually been told, Councillor Candlish. Could somebody explain to me why the Nutbourne Road area in Drayton and Farlington has not been included in this programme?
I'm happy to give a first answer, Councillor Boshin. We'll see whether that satisfies you. So, in determining where to go for a variety of, from a confluence of issues that have been arising for some time, Baffins is essentially chosen, and here, for the avoidance of doubt, I don't speak about the ward or even a particular specific geographic area. It is broadly the area of Baffins has been identified as an area that needs work around evaluating whether to bring in a parking scheme, whether there are other things that could be done in the area. So for that reason, it has seemed the most opportune to be the first off the rank. Looking at the resources that we have within house, to do that work, that is essentially going to take the better part of this year to do. So, given that is the case, that is essentially the only firm one that has been put into the report, and there is a list of other ones which are also identified as requiring action. The ones which are listed there are the ones where currently, for a variety of reasons, some of which have been outlined, the biggest number of objections or issues have come forward, and that's why they are identified there. But there is no firm commitment to a specific choice of programme beyond the end of this year, because I think that will need to be determined by a combination of the resources that are available to do the task, the issues that are present, and then whether there is a smart way for those things to be sequenced, because it might be that some smaller schemes might be able to be fitted into a space where a larger scheme might require a longer period of time to get started because of overlapping issues. So that is the reason, because I could be corrected on this, but across most of the city, so if we start from the point, where is there a parking pressure in the city, it is pretty much universal now. There is always some residents who think something should be done, and very often their suggestion for that is now a residential parking zone. The number of inquiries that comes in varies by area and over time, and that's what I've used in determining what is the immediate priority, and then I would basically be looking to re-evaluate that decision at a later point in the year.
I'm not really quite sure what you've said there, but I'll just go back to my particular one there and just give you a bit of history around this if I can. Ward councillors surveyed this particular area that we're talking about in the middle of last year, and what we used was the consultation document, albeit we put our own top and tail on it, that would go out to residents anyway. We got 96% of residents say that there were parking issues in this area, all driven by the local industrial estate, and 71% of residents were in support of an RPZ. This got reported back. We had officers come up to look at the area during October last year. In March of this year, I had an email from an officer which, and I will quote, "Now that the work on the current RPZ programme is nearing completion, we plan to present the next programme later this year." Well, I'm presuming this is it. All RPZ requests, including this one for the Nutbourne Road area, will be considered as our next programme is finalised. And then I get an email yesterday basically saying, oh, it's not being considered now. Now, not only have the ward councillors gone out to say it is going to be considered as part of the next programme, so did the Labour candidate in Drayton and Farlington in the last election do exactly the same thing. And I want to understand why, having been given that undertaking and having gone through all that process to the middle of last year, it features nowhere on this programme, and to quote, it could be a number of years before it gets considered. And it comes back, actually, to a word that Councillor Sanders used, which is the word trust. I don't have any trust in this process, quite frankly, Councillor Candlish, because I was given an undertaking by an officer who's present in this chamber that it would be considered as part of this programme, and here I am looking at this programme, and it's not. So, effectively, either the officer has made this decision, in which case I want to understand why the officer has made this decision, and also understand why I've not been shown the courtesy of somebody at least telling me that before I found out in this report, or you've made this decision, and what I can surmise from that is that you're looking at a Lib Dem ward in Baffins over a Conservative ward in Drayton and Farlington. These are the conclusions I'm drawing, unless somebody is going to convince me otherwise.
So I will try to convince you otherwise. So the choice of Baffins has been driven because there have been a number of issues that were emerging last year about road space, road use, curb use within the area, and a conflict between safety considerations and parking concerns. So on, if you like, on a register of areas looking most in acute need to do it, my decision, it's not an officer decision, this was my decision that I made essentially in principle during the course of last year, was that Baffins was the place where we needed to do some activity, because there are other things going on in that area as well which are also causing issues with traffic. And I have a lot of long-standing correspondence with people in Baffins around those areas. Now, it is true there's long-standing correspondence with residents from most areas about traffic, but in my judgment, those were most acute in Baffins. So having made the decision in principle to go with Baffins, we then looked at the scale of the job that was going to be required to do that, particularly, and I'll come back to at some point, the fact that I think that we need to be expanding what we have previously done in terms of an RPZ to actually look at it a little bit more holistically, and the interaction between parking, other forms of transport, developments with an area, before coming to a decision and put those in front of residents, that this year essentially is going to be absorbed by that one ward. There are other wards, including Lib Dem ones, which would like to be having activities sooner, which are not in the programme. So it is true, it is not specifically called out in the list. It is an identified area. There is a genuine issue there that has been highlighted, as you point out, that it was not chosen by me as the priority area, and within the scope of this year, I don't see scope for doing any other ward, or not ward, any other area.
This particular area in Drayton Farlington doesn't feature anywhere on this RPZ programme. No matter what the priority is, it's not there. And the email I received yesterday basically says the Nutbourne Road area is not included in the proposed future RPZ and would therefore not be scheduled to be consulted on in the next few years. Now, we've got a significant issue there, which is basically saying Councillor Bowe should go away and shut up. But we've put this forward time and time again. And as I said, I have an email from March basically saying it's going to be part of this programme. I'd like to understand why it's not even on the proposed programme that we have at all, why it has suddenly been dropped. And perhaps somebody could explain to me at the same time why nobody bothered to actually tell me that until I chased it yesterday.
So there are three things there. So firstly, I think the choice of the word a few years is possibly not ideal, because the report is clear about being unclear about what is happening subsequent to the one that I have progressed. In terms of the communication of that, that's always a discussion point, and if you haven't been, if you feel you haven't been properly communicated on that, I either apologise or we can talk about that separately. But on the substance of the issue, it is not forgotten, it is simply not in the programme. We could add it easily to the list of the other places that are called out. I don't know the specific number of resident write-ins or other forms of communication that have been provided to rank them. It wasn't the top one, and therefore all the others are subsequent years and will be depending on the priorities then.
I can only go from what officers tell me, basically, from when I asked the questions. And we had a number of officers visit the area last October. The agreement then was the fact that there was a major parking issue, predominantly driven by 2 or 3 businesses in the area that were using residential streets as their own car park, because the public transport to that area is not great. In fact, it's pretty poor, if I'm pretty honest with you. And therefore, an RPZ was the way to go. So I've had 2, if you take what was given to us when we had the officer meeting, who actually watched, and I'll name the business, Richmond Hyundai vehicles driving slowly around trying to find somewhere to park, and then parking on verges and double yellow lines and anywhere they chose to park so that they could get into the business, and an email telling me it was going to happen, and it's not happening. And it just strikes me it's pretty poor, to be quite honest, that we're actually faced with this. Because we've gone out and communicated to our residents, as has the Labour candidate, as I said in the last election, saying it was going to be included on the next RPZ programme, because that's the information that we got, as did the Portsmouth North MP. And yet a decision has been taken, and I don't know why, because the email doesn't explain why, not to include it in this particular programme. And as I said, I can only go on what I'm being offered here, won't be considered for a number of years. Now, I've got to go back and tell my residents that, because it certainly damn well won't be an officer that's going to go back and tell them that, having made that promise. And what am I going to do? Perhaps somebody can give me some advice. Or maybe the officers in question could tell me after the meeting.
So I understand the issue that you are raising, Councillor Bosher. I can't really say it other than the way I feel that I've said it before, which is, so as the ultimate decision maker in this area, I have chosen to make Baffins the priority one for this year, and I deliberately
I'm not talking about the priority one here. I get what you're saying about the priority one, but there is a list of proposed new areas to look at there. That's what I'm looking at. Because at the very least, if it was included in that proposed area to look at, I can at least go back and say it's in the programme. But I can't even say that to residents, having been told that that was what was going to happen.
And there, I think that is a fair point to be making, Councillor Bosher. Hayley, I can see you gesturing.
Yeah, I just want to sort of come in and clarify some of the correspondence. So I think we've previously told Councillor Bosher that the Nutbourne Road area will be considered as our next programme is finalised. So that area, along with all the other requests for all the other areas in the city, were considered. And what's been put in front of members today is the kind of finalised programme in terms of those that have been brought out top. So all requests are recorded and monitored, and the report focuses on the areas that are considered to have the greatest need to be taken forward based on feedback received and the other relevant factors. Obviously, the programme is set out till end of 2031, and there's only a finite amount of schemes we could deliver in that time period. So that's why we've had to draw the line and not list every single zone that we've had a request for, a number of requests for. We've had to only list the top ones as it stands.
I'm looking to help Councillor Bosher.
So what we're saying is, apart from the fact that I'm finding out about this now, is that actually the comment in the next few years is probably correct. My residents are not going to see anything, not even going to go on a list much before 2031 is what we're actually saying here. That's the information I've just gleaned from that. But obviously it seems that officers are making the decision as to what does go forward and what doesn't go forward. Having been told it is going to go forward, again, I come back to the fact that nobody has shown me the courtesy of a member of the City Council by telling me otherwise.
Hayley, and then I'll have a comment.
So whilst we've listed the ones that at this point in time are coming out top, the remaining requests remain logged and will be considered at review points in the programme for future consideration to be brought forward. So hopefully that is clear. I think it was paragraph 5.9 from memory in the report that sort of outlines that. So there is scope for it to be included still at those review points if it's determined needed.
So to help Councillor Bosher and anyone else before they ask about their particular zone or potential area for doing a survey, yes, it is 5.9. And I'll read it. The prioritisation of other zones will be reviewed at the start of each programme period. So perhaps the word programme is the problem here. So it is not that this is through until 2031. It is simply that, for me, I think this will be an annual process. And indeed, not even an annual process. It's a project and capacity related programme. So my judgment at the moment is that for the year 26-27, all of the resources that we have available to develop. So firstly, I made a decision that we were going to look at new zones over reviews. And then within the new zones, that the priority zone to be tackled was the area of Baffins. All other decisions are frankly not made yet, because it is something that we will have to evaluate on an ongoing basis based on the observed need, the capacity that we have available, and any other factors that are applying at the time. So it is not that your scheme is being pushed back to 2031, it is more that it is not in 26-27 in the list. It could be added to the list identified here, but we could have a long list of areas which have requested them, and I am deliberately trying not to put a priority in the ones that we don't currently have capacity for, because I want to make that a bit more agile, that we make that decision when we start to see what resources we have available and what the priorities in the city are at that time. Councillor Tyndall.
Yeah, just to pick up, I'm not going to dwell on the point because after our briefing, I went back through my emails and exactly the same has happened in my ward. I've got an email to say that we can't do it at the moment, but you will be prioritised for the inclusion in the 2026 programme. So I think we need to work on the communication between officers and councillors, because as Councillor Beauchamp quite rightly says, is we're the ones that have to then go back and go, well, actually what we've been told is incorrect now.
I don't think it's not incorrect, but I think I understand that the communication on this point has not been good around the understanding that you've taken away about what inclusion in the programme means and the expectation around timings. And that was one of the reasons for putting also in the length of time which an RPZ takes to develop as part of the pack, to help communicate to people that these are quite chunky bits of work to do and therefore they don't come through quickly. To be truthful, I'm hearing from this that that's something we need to go back and have a look at in terms of maybe it will be better to try to develop a clearer list of programmes, or at least buckets of places, and to make sure that everyone at least sees themselves on the radar picture.
If I can, Chair, we did used to do that. I was a cabinet member for transport, as you can remember, and we did used to put forward a programme of the areas that needed to be considered. In fact, I was probably the cabinet member probably doing the most of them back in 2018, 19 and thereabouts. So we had a priority programme that was going through and being so that people could see when their expectation actually was. And it was a finite programme. It started at one and it finished at another, basically. And it was done as I think it was a 3-year programme back then. If you look back at the reports, it was very clear in what it actually said and the way we actually approached it. This report has changed and it's become a more, and I think we may add more, you know, we will review it and we will, it says at the start, it's 5.9, the prioritisation of the zones will be reviewed at the start of each new programme period. Well, what's the new programme period might be the first question I would like to ask, because if that was a 3-year cycle, which it was, the new programme period wouldn't be until 2029, in which case my ward and my issue wouldn't go on to any programme where it isn't a priority of that until 2029 at the very, very earliest, which comes back to my email of about a number of years. I mean, what you're saying does not give me any comfort, having been given an assurance that it would be included in the programme and the process that we went through last year. Residents had an expectation. It's a very high topic in my particular area, and it certainly pitches businesses against residents because of where it actually is. And I'm now being told nothing is going to happen and it doesn't feature anywhere. Well, I can go back and I'll communicate that in any political way I choose to communicate it. But the fact that the Lib Dems don't feature in Drayton and Farlington isn't going to really add much to that, to be quite honest. But I will communicate that back to my residents that, having been told that we were included, we've now been decided that we are not included. It's going to be a number of years before they are considered. That ain't going to look good for the Cabinet or indeed the officers.
So, Councillor Beauchamp, I take responsibility then for 2 things. Firstly, I have deliberately chosen not to show a programme going out further than the next year, because that is the period of time that I was looking at for the resources. So I accept in your challenge around 5.9 the word programme is unhelpful. In my head, I would have viewed that as annual or even sooner than that, depending on how we go with the project that we have, that I have chosen to be the next one off the rank to operate on. So I understand your position. I cannot reverse the past or the word that is written here, but that is my intent. Because I think one of the things that I have taken from my time doing this is that actually setting some of these programmes up for years in advance actually may not be the right thing to do, because it might be that a change in the order, for example, it might be that smaller schemes, and that would probably be one of them, might be able to be fitted in sooner into a gap if some resources became available to do that. Whereas if you put it in a programme, you might be putting it further out and there might be no need to do that, or you would be doing something different. So that's a choice that I have made. It is probably correct that that has not helped in the communication point of view, and for that I take responsibility. Councillor Heaney.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Kalish. I've got sort of three issues I want to ask questions about, but I'll take the last issue I was going to ask a question about because it actually refers to some correspondence that I received last night and a telephone call that I received from a resident at 8:30 this morning. The gentleman concerned wrote because he was raising the issue of where Harrison House, which I think is in Nelson Ward, in relation to its location within the parking zones there, they're close to FD and FJ. Basically, he was saying they'd rather be in the other zone than the one they're currently in. They've been raising this issue since last year. He sent me some of the correspondence. I don't know, I've got all of it, but it goes right back to April of last year. There's some correspondence from former councillor Zackley as well, and I think you've been copied into it, so you may well have had correspondence about this, but I only got this last night. He did say he was going to come and do a deputation, but I didn't know whether he had actually already done that or whether he hasn't. He's not here today, so I'm assuming for some reason he hasn't been able to put the deputation in time. So I am really sort of raising it partly on his behalf, but I would have raised questions if he'd been here and spoken about it as well. Because again, it's another one of these issues where there's an anomaly and an issue which has been going on for some time and nobody's addressing it. And while I understand the pressures on doing things, it's sometimes good to be able to sort out these smaller issues. Admittedly, it does require consultation, it does require TRO, but these seem to be, or this one seems to be relatively straightforward in that I assume all the residents who live in Harrison House are quite happy about having it changed. So it seems a straightforward process. I do wish we could find a way of dealing with these niggly little issues which actually cause real inconvenience to residents, but could be done either by a TRO or a special meeting, or, you know, it doesn't seem to me to be the ones, you know, should take too long to deal with. So that's my query on that one. So I'll lay that one in front of you and let you decide what you want to do about that one.
Let me address those more broadly. I would love to find simple ways of tackling small niggly parking issues. However, the reality is the closer you get them to, I mean, Mr. Sharp here is a perfect example of this. For the individual residents who are concerned, these are important issues. They seem straightforward matters to resolve often, but they link into wider issues. So we then get into consultations. The issue that you're raising there would involve changing parking zones. Now, that would, I don't know, but I suspect that would actually require consultations going back to other residents across the zone, and then you have a whole cycle of doing things for what might be a straightforward, and indeed it might even be a positive move for that resident or that block, but would have implications for the wider area. So sometimes, I'm afraid, I feel that I am forced to make a decision which is kind of the greatest good for the greatest number, or the most pressing issue, and that does result in some residents, honestly, having issues that they have felt unanswered or undealt with for many years. The answer is, or the truth is, not that they are ignored or not listened to, it is that they are not taken forward because in the wider scheme of things, other choices are being made. And that, I am afraid, is a difficulty of the type of actions that we're talking about here. You had two more questions.
I had two more issues, actually, that I want to ask questions
about.
My mistake. Yes. One of them is about the choice of zones for further action, which obviously I'll talk about in a moment. But the other one is about the reviews of zones, because you mentioned 3 zones, 2 of which obviously impact on my ward, so I do want to ask about those as well. I'll start by asking about the proposal for the Baffins area, because if you look on the map, Baffins is, in one sense, quite a distinct area with the railway line and other things which provide quite hard borders on those. In the report on paragraph 3.3, it says, we consider introducing or reviewing RPZs in areas where parking pressure is high, such as where commuters, visitors or nearby facilities reduce the availability of on-street parking for local residents. there isn't much information about what's promoting that. So which of those issues has put Baffins at the top of the priority list for consideration?
So in my head, it was driven by a collection of things, including but not exclusively. There have been a lot of discussions around the introduction. So we've all acknowledged that there is very often people on one side and on the other about these types of issue. So in the Baffins area, there has been a lot of concern raised by residents around safety issues, parking on corners. That leads into double yellow lines. Double yellow lines restrict the amount of parking space that is available if they are introduced in places where they weren't before or they are expanded. In the Baffins area, there are developments like Moneyfields, which is also changing the nature and the volume of traffic, and it seemed ripe for a more holistic approach to tackling, I'm trying to be careful with my words here, transport issues within that area. Now, the single biggest issue is parking. So you could not have a sensible, holistic look at that area without tackling parking. And there have been a lot of requests for a considerable period of time, as Councillor Sanders was outlining, from residents in the Baffins area to be looking at that, to be re-looking at the permit issue. So, putting those things together, that's how I arrived at the choice last year that Baffins was likely to be the first one.
That's actually quite helpful, and it would probably be helpful if when the reports are written, some of these issues could at least be put on the report so we understand sort of where the questions have come from. But there isn't really much to give an indication as to why. I mean, in my head, thought that was probably going to be one of the Moneyfields because obviously that is in close to narrow roads. I mean, I'm not quite sure how our residence parking scheme in itself is going to solve those problems because you'd have to have restrictions for much longer than we normally put in for that. But, you know, obviously that's something that we can explore. So that's useful. Are there any issues with the hospital parking in the south of the ward? Because I know that has been a problem in the past, but some of the roads are now residence parking, so that's been found out. But is hospital parking an issue in the south of the ward?
There are many issues. That could be one of them. We could probably list 4 or 5 others if we went through them. And here is the reason why they're not all listed in the report, because if you put an exhaustive list, it would be very long and different people have different issues. So it is a judgment thing. And the second thing is that we have to remember is that the whole idea behind these is that these are neighbourhood parking zones. So they're not aligned to wards. They are more aligned to areas, geographic areas, where it is reasonable to expect people to kind of share a parking zone area. We often have to tell people that you don't get parking in front of your house, you don't get parking in your street, you get parking in an area.
I mean, I suppose, excuse me, as a local resident, I mean, the issues that obviously affect me are when Pompey are playing at home. But I'm usually home early enough because I go regularly. But trying to restrict that would be quite difficult to do, and I think it's one of the things you have to live with. Obviously, I live opposite a park, and so we get lots of visitors coming and parking in the roads in front of my house and others if I go out. I don't think it would be fair to basically introduce a residence parking scheme to stop visitors coming and using the park, which I think would be going a bit over the top. And we're just about to refurbish the Baffins court area for five-side football. So again, you know, that's an interesting. So I understand what you're saying about the issues, but I don't think we have to list every single issue that is there. We can just say some of the key issues that have been raised are the following, because that would help, I think, to understand what's going on. I mean, I'll be interested to see what happens with the consultation. I mean, I shall make my own response in time when it comes. But I think the point I would make is that for many areas which are like this, the problem is just there are too many vehicles and not enough car parking space. And I've sometimes had to park near the college on an evening if I've come back very late in the evening because I can't get anywhere near my house. We have solved one problem, which is obviously related to long-stay vehicles parking on Tangier Road, but that was a specific issue which has been addressed, and I think that has been useful in freeing up parking for people who use the sports ground, but also ensuring that it doesn't become an area for them. So I'm not against, bespoke solutions, but I think maybe it's about bespoke solutions possibly sometimes rather than just an RPZ in itself. I'll move on to the next issue about the reviews, because partly the report says that we will prioritise new parking zones. However, you have mentioned that there are 3 areas that you're going to review. I'm only going to talk about KC and MD because they're both in the ward I represent. KC, 24-hour zone, 3 hours free parking for non-residents. That zone, I understand, has had many more parking permits issued than there ever were parking spaces, and that's a historical thing. And I'd be very interested to know what a review of that area would entail. I mean, are we talking about a complete new survey about what are the issues, or are we going to have a survey about how the parking scheme is working, or a combination of both? I'm quite interested to know what the review will do. In relation to MD, I was elected at the time MD was being consulted on. In the period just before I was elected, it was consulted on, and the decision was made after I was elected. And the key issue for residents at the time that was causing the most sort of, I suppose, disagreement was what's the appropriate time for the zone. Having recognised that, talked to lots and lots of people and getting no consensus whatsoever, when the decision came to the full cabinet meeting, because it went to full cabinet, not to the cabinet member, I went to the deputation and said, would the cabinet please consider a review of the timings after, say, 6 months? And they very kindly agreed to do that, and they did that. And in fact, what happened was, after the zone had been in operation for that period, people thought that the 4:30 to 6:30 was actually the right timing, because obviously it's balancing the commercial people, people wanting to go and visit the area for the theatre, etc. So again, I'm not quite sure what we're going to be doing in terms of a review. What will the sort of terms of reference to the review be? The other problem I have is that the possibility of that review ever taking place, because, as you say, you prioritise new zones, and we've got new zones proposed. Councillor Bosher would like a new zone. Is there any possibility that KC and MD are ever going to get reviewed?
So let me answer that one. By saying, and again, possibly invite more darts my way, but the purpose of putting some reviews on there was to indicate to people, so from where I sit at the moment, from what I see, those are probably the most common places where we see issues that would cause us to want to have a review. KC in particular is very highly pressured. It's been there a long time. There are differences between the west and the east. You raise a number of excellent questions as to what might the review contain, and it is essentially the same volume of work to therefore do as it would be to do a new one. So, however, I'm also cognizant that across the city, the whole city is becoming more and more pressured on parking. I think someone said it, Portsmouth isn't getting bigger, but the number of vehicles is rising. And we have limited resources to deploy against this. So the intent on the review there was to indicate that reviews they're not forgotten, because in a little bit of the way that Councillor Bosher is, I think, to an extent rightly reacting, people feel that they have been promised reviews, but we never get to reviews. It is a can that is consistently being kicked down the road, and I have given it one more thwack because I have chosen to absolutely not include it within this year. And at the end of this year, I am making no guarantees now that that would be a priority over Councillor Bosher's area versus the Copner area versus any other area that you wanted to choose in the city. What I would be doing in another year's time, when we came to look at the resources that we have and the areas and the pressures we've got, is to choose between those things. That is essentially what we have to do here. And just going back one of your issues, not questions, the Patangia Road is a good example, because although we solved a specific problem there of the long duration taxis, actually it has caused some displacement. We have had people complaining that there are now more vehicles parking nearby. And it is those kind of interactions that are making us think that we actually need to get better about how we look at these whole transport problems, to try to elevate them, to look at them in a more holistic way, and to look at about what other variables that we have to play, recognising the fact for a lot of people cars do still remain essential. However, if we expand the scope of one of those residential parking review informal surveys to include consideration of other things, by definition it's going to raise more issues and will take probably longer to wrangle and resolve and be more resource intensive. And that has the consequence of squeezing out in time some of the action on other zones. Any other questions, comments, or issues? That one, Councillor Bosher, is certainly outside of my scope of influence to effect. So I'm going to come back to report. I've listened to some of the comments being said, and I think we will take some action outside of this meeting around those. Focusing narrowly in on the work stream, essentially, that I am going to authorise to start. I'm going to take the recommendation in the report as is, but I will take outside of this and come back to this committee, actually, with some thoughts on the how we might talk about a longer term programme. I think there's some ways we can do that, and I feel Councillor Bosher's pain. So, in terms of formalities, I am going to approve the two recommendations as set out in the report, 2.1 and 2.2, noting in 2.1 that we will provide some additional work outside of this to come back to people with. Okay, moving now to parking tariffs, another popular topic. Who do we have talking to that one? Kevin,
Thank you.
can you present the report?
Thank you, Councillor Candlish. The Council's parking strategy identifies three main areas of parking across the city, and this report presents parking data which shows the usage in these areas over the last 5 years. While there's been an expansion in the use of buses, car usage remains high. The report recommends an increase in the metered tariffs and the season tickets of around 5% to try and encourage drivers to use alternatives to the car. If the increase is agreed, the Council will arrange for the signs to be changed and the machines and Ringo tariffs to be altered, and we will publish a notice in the post and put notices at the affected locations informing users of the increase at least 21 days before it takes effect. The report also recommends that in future years the Assistant Director for Transport, in liaison with the Cabinet Member for Transport, proposes tariff increases which broadly increase tariffs in line with policy and the Consumer Price Index. The proposal will be communicated, if agreed, to all members using the Members' Information Service before being advertised publicly. This is the system we currently use when proposing changes to other parts of TROs. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So we've got no deputations here that I'm aware of. Are there any questions? Councillor Heaney has his light on.
That's fine.
Oh. Okay, thank you very much. The first question I wanted to ask is when, if this recommendation is passed, will the charges come into effect?
It will be a couple of months before we put them in effect, because we need to order the signs and change the tariffs and give people 21 days notice.
So we're talking possibly September?
End of summer, after the summer, yeah.
September, okay. My next question is, why was this report brought to the June meeting for a decision on changing tariffs for the new financial year? Because normally when we change charges, we do them in the spring, around about the budget time, in meetings around there. And I do notice that last year, the increase that was proposed actually did come in April. So why was the decision made to bring this report now rather than before the new financial year?
So one of the things that Kevin was talking to there was we don't have a policy of indexation. We have historically not. We've made the decision as and when. The decision was made to hold the prices of tariffs. We don't like putting prices up. It is never a popular thing to do. I'm sure Toby Payne from the News isn't here today, but I'm sure that news of a parking increase will find its way to his desk, and I will be accused of waging a new war on motorists by putting up parking charges. So we essentially have had staggered the increase in pricing. If you look at the price increase of 5%, that's actually slightly ahead of inflation at the moment.
It's interesting because if you go to the next report, which is on the implementation of the transport strategy, one of the things it says in there is there's huge pressure on the parking reserve because the parking reserve is having extra costs relating to subsidised buses, basically. Given the financial pressures, it would have seemed sensible to me, rather than to lose what is effectively nearly 5 months of income, that you would have thought it would have been a good idea to bring that forward for the for April, beginning of the financial year. You've effectively lost 5 months of income on the new financial year. You seem to imply that because it's unpopular, therefore you didn't bring it in. But it just seems to me that this is an example of we don't want to bring this in because it's just before the elections. But now the election's over, we'll bring in the charges. I think that may as well as what has gone on here.
Councillor Heaney, you are aware, as I am, that these are choices that the administration can make in terms of where it balances its budget, where it chooses to raise revenue, where it doesn't choose to raise revenue. I would say that parking charges are not something that we do to maximise revenue. So it is driven by a combination of policies and reaction to those policies. So we also have responsibilities for things like businesses at the seafront. They are always petitioning us to keep the price of car parking down. This gives them a summer at a time when it's quite difficult for many of them to operate. I personally would probably like us to be moving to a system where we were regularly, annually making changes to parking charges, because I think that would make the whole system simpler to administer. But if you look back over the years, some years we've not had any increase at all, some years we've had higher increases, some years, like this year, we have an increase that's at the end of the summer, other times we've had it at the start of the summer.
Okay, well, I'd like to also to move on to the recommendation number 2.3, because basically what appears to be being said here is that in future, any such decision about raising charges will not come anywhere near a decision meeting. It will be done via MIS. Members will have an opportunity to comment, but I'm unclear about whether this is going to be a Part 2 or a Part 3 item at MIS, because a Part 2 item would allow a member to ask for the item to come for decision, because it also says in this recommendation, proposed tariff increases broadly increase the parking tariffs in line with policy and the CPI. It doesn't say I'll increase it by CPI, it says broadly in line. So you could decide to do whatever you want, because broadly is broadly. But there won't be any public accountability for that decision, because it'll take place within the MIS system and members will see it. They will have a chance to comment, and then it'll be publicly announced once the decision is formally agreed. So I'm not clear whether this decision is going to be one where members can actually ask for it to come, because, for example, you haven't mentioned the hours of charging within this. Now, is that included in a possible change that might take place? Because that isn't included in this report, but of course that would be a way of changing the way in which parking is charged. You could extend the hours of some areas which currently have, a set hour, but you could increase it. So I'm a bit concerned about this decision being taken out of the public domain, where we don't have a chance to question and find out exactly what's going on. So can you clarify what this delegation is going to be?
I'm going to look for some help in terms of MIS parts 2 and 3.
I believe it will be in the part where you can call it in.
So I think, if my understanding, So the purpose of the 2.3 is to try to move towards a little bit what Councillor Heaney is talking about, having a more regular programme and kind of an expectation that the things are going to move each year rather than having a big, you might argue, political discussion as to whether it should move in any one year or any other year. And the broadly in line is because if you actually look at the detail kind of price point by price point, you don't want something moving up by 2.5p. You want it to move up by some kind of round number. So that's the discretion behind it. In terms of the MIS and whether it is a formal call-in, I'll be honest, I'm procedurally willing to take advice on this point. The intent is that it is not that this meeting, ultimately the decision is mine, and this is an opportunity for councillors rightly to ask questions and make comments in a public space. But ultimately the decision is with me. I think that kind of a parking decision, if it was a significant deviation from what you might broadly expect from staying within policy and CPI, then I would expect a councillor to, here I don't know the language, I would have call it in, but I may not be calling it in correctly. Councillor Bosher, you've often helped me on these matters.
Apologies, I missed the start of that. Call of nature, as they say. When it comes to a call-in procedure, it cannot be done based on the decision. So if you were to, for sake of argument, to decide to say, right, I'm going to put up the parking tariffs by 50%, we may not like that, but provided it's gone through the proper stages, it's your decision. The same applies to something going on to MIS. If Transport were to decide to do it by 50%, we can't call it in because we don't like the decision. We have to do it on the basis of things like incorrect information, insufficient information, or incorrect financial information. Provided those three things have been ticked, there is no scrutiny attached to this whatsoever by 2.3. They can just advertise it on MIS. It gives 5 working days for somebody to call it in, and then you need a number of signatures to be able to do that, and then it would go back as a report. But also part of that call-in process says that the report has to go, so if you make a decision based on this report, you cannot then, if it gets called in and the city solicitor agrees to that call-in process, your decision holds because you can't implement it because it's being called in, but your report has to go back if the call-in is upheld in a different guise. So actually, it's probably going to extend the process by putting it on MIS, but it also doesn't give any scrutiny. I'm not going to die in a ditch over 5%, to be quite honest, but I think you should remove 2.3 from that. It's always come back as a report to allow for proper scrutiny by the opposition spokesman, and it's not as if it's something that is going to be coming back every other month. It's something that's going to be done effectively annual, and I don't see what the issue is. I think we're going to find ourselves in a situation that if it has to go through the MIS process, none of us will have a say or be able to scrutinise what's going to happen with increases in parking tariffs. And I would lose recommendation 2.3 in its entirety if I were you, Chair.
Councillor Heaney?
Yeah, I mean, I think Simon wasn't in the room, but exactly the point I made about the lack of scrutiny. It's a decision taken behind closed doors, which we can't actually scrutinise. I mean, I think, the timing of such a thing also is important. I think we must do them before the beginning of the financial year because I think it's sensible that we have these decisions to implement during a new financial year. We don't want to unnecessarily lose income for the City Council given the poor state of council finances generally. We are struggling with budget savings every year, so we need to maximise the income that we can generate. I see your point about policy, but I think there is now confusion, I think, within the transport policy about what the purpose of the car parking charges are, because you say it's not about raising revenue, but it is necessary to raise revenue in order to fund other things, as I mentioned earlier. But the transport policy basically says we are trying to discourage car use in the city, and car parking charges is one of the ways in which you can do that. But you don't seem to be thinking about whether that is something you want to do or not. It looks like you don't. So you're saying, yeah, we have too many cars, we don't have. Encouraging people to, or discouraging people to use cars may be about the financial incentives. I mean, we talk about encouraging people to use the park and ride and not the city centre car parks. So clearly there has been some differential there. So I think you're confused about what your policy is. I don't think there's any clarity about what your policy is in relation to parking charges. But maybe that's a debate for another day.
I'll address it quickly, which is the policy is not to discourage car use. The policy is to provide better alternatives so that people choose not to use their car. It's subtle but an important difference, because that goes to the pricing choices, as it were, that we make for car parking charges. If we were to be maximising revenue, then we might well be making some other choices. If we were looking to really discourage car use through pricing, we might be making some other things. These things are a balance that we are striking to do, because another set of council policies is all around ensuring economic vitality in the city, and parking is a consideration for visitors coming in. It is a consideration for businesses who want people to come in and park. And is a consideration for residents who, feel that they don't want to pay for more than they have to for coming in and parking. So at 5%, if you look at the sweep of price increases over the last few years, it is probably just slightly ahead of inflation. If you took it on a compound annual basis, and that reflects an incremental nudge strategy towards the objectives that you're talking to. We are certainly trying to move the city to become less dependent on cars, because in doing so that tackles air quality, tackles congestion, and takes away some of the parking issues that fundamentally are bedeviling the city.
Just one thing I'd like to get an answer to, which I didn't, maybe because we asked a number of questions, but it's about the issue of changing the timings of parking charges, because some charges finish at certain times and they're different. So I'd much rather you didn't delegate power away, but within that, are you going to, if you were to do that, would you bring changes in the timings of parking charges to a decision meeting, or would you put that within a delegated authority to make that decision?
I can see Lisa wanting to say something at this point. Or Kevin. Then I'll say something.
Yes, if we're changing the hours, we would need to do a full TRO and full consultation and bring it back, any objections back to the Cabinet meeting. I was just looking to clarify what I said earlier about the MIS. The MIS is divided into three parts. Part one, decisions by Cabinet and individual Cabinet members subject to Councillors' right to have the matter called in for scrutiny. Part two, proposals from managers which they would like to implement subject to Councillors' right to have the matter referred to the relevant Cabinet member. I think I said it was called in. I think that's my use of bad language. I think it would, if the recommendation was agreed, it would go into part two, because it would be an officer decision in consultation with the Cabinet member, but councillors would have the right to have it referred to the Cabinet member or regulatory committee for decision.
That effectively is changing the onus on a report that has traditionally come before the Cabinet member for consideration. So therefore we would get sight of it a fortnight in advance at the very least, or go through the briefing meetings. I don't go to them, but they can go that. So you get plenty of sight of it as opposition spokesman. But MIS comes out as one of the 1,000,001 emails that we all get. And it's then putting the onus back on the councillors that you've got to read the small print, so to speak. I would rather it was the other way around in that respect, in so much that we have 5 working days to say it should be referred to the Cabinet member for consideration. And then you probably have to call a special meeting to consider one item on parking charges in this particular instance and bring all the officers over here and everybody else out of work and whatever, as opposed to include it as a normal schedule report once a year when it's on an agenda with a large number of other things.
Thank you, Councillor Bosher. Anyone got anything else? Councillor Tyndall?
Yeah, just on the bit about increasing the sustainability and encouraging via that, what research have we gained from the briefing about where other councils have done that and actually seen a decrease in the use of cars and the sustainable transport being used more effectively?
I can see the back row are agitating to speak, so I'm going to give them a chance to answer that question. I will say that this is one of those topics where actually you can probably find evidence that supports your case in pretty much any direction. So I will be very impressed if Kevin is able to make this a definitive answer.
I think there's lots of evidence throughout the country that parking charges can decrease the amount of traffic, but there's no firm rule about, if you increase it by 5%, you'll get an X percentage decrease in traffic. It depends on the individual circumstances, and certainly in councils where I've worked before, and we monitor the usage in the way that table's set out. I think even in that table it shows, if you look at the districts, when we increased the on-street charge as opposed to the off-street charge, you can see a shift in 2024 and 2025 to off-street rather than on-street. Whether that is entirely due to the tariff or not is, because there's so many other factors that affect people's travelling modes. But I think it's fairly well established that parking tariffs are a factor in determining people's choices in parking.
I'm going to give you the follow-up.
Yeah, well, first of all, we're trying to increase sustainable forms of transport, and if there is out there, we need it referenced in our report so that we can actually go and have a look at that rather than it's out there.
Sorry, I'm not...
So in 4.1, it says the council wishes to encourage people to use more sustainable forms of transport, and it says about the increasing buses and things like that. But is that because the parking charges have increased that in other councils and they've started to use the sustainable transport, or is that just increasing buses? And if there is evidence out there, which there could be, and I'm sure there is, can we have it referenced in the report so that we can go and see that and see the actual evidence that increasing parking charges in a council will increase the sustainable forms of transport being used in that area or that council?
I'm going to ask you to ask that question again in about 10 minutes maybe, depending on how long we take to conclude this section, because I think that goes to some of our long-term aspirations and why we're doing things. But I have to say that we are evidence-based or evidence-led, but ultimately you have to make decisions based on the evidence that is available to you, and that is not always that every single thing can be reported. I think it is a reasonable assertion or causality of logic that if we have more people using buses, bikes, walking versus taking a car, that would be a more sustainable, that would fit with the sustainability thing. I think it's a reasonable assumption that if prices were put up on cars, then at the edges there would be some people who would say, oh, what the hell, it's going to cost me a £5 to go and park there, I'll take the bus or something. If you're asking me to show the evidence that 2.3% more people in Portsmouth go up, I am afraid I will probably be disappointing you. So it is trying to put these things together into something that makes sense. And again, if I go back to, we are neither trying to drive this as a revenue matter, nor is our policy to make a radical change in the transport infrastructure. What we're trying to set up is a series of things in parallel which are nudging people towards more sustainable practices, electric vehicles, more buses, encouraging people to walk and cycle, whilst reflecting the current reality that the majority of people in the city still get around by car, and in a cost of living crisis, you know, you don't want to make that change too fast, because that otherwise would have negative impacts on business. So it's a perilous, narrow path that we are trying to tread here, and some of it, I will be honest, is a judgment call.
Just last comment. So for EV cars, that's not a price increase then?
So here, Councillor Tyndall, you rightly spot the overlap of policies, because an EV is a it is a vehicle, and all cars in the matter of parking, because they basically occupy a piece of space, are charged something. I do note that there are, so going to the point of evidence and learning from other local authorities, there are other local authorities now that do charge differently for vehicles according to their characteristics, their size, their emissions type. I don't know, maybe they have it by the colour of the vehicle. And that is something that maybe we will consider in the future. At the moment, we don't have that within our suite of options, and therefore all cars will be affected by these parking charges equally.
You said that charging EVs a different rate for parking isn't within our suite of options. Does that mean that we aren't allowed to do it, or we haven't chosen to do it?
I think I'm correct in saying this, and I will look to anyone to correct me if I'm wrong. We cannot currently do it. We could choose to do it. So far, we have not chosen to do it, but it is something, for transparency, I've asked officers to start looking at, because I think that might be something that comes down the track. But we are not there yet. It is not part of our current repertoire. Having listened to the commentary on the fundamental point of what we are going to do in terms of the parking tariffs, I am going to approve 2.1 and 2.2. On the point of 2.3, I am minded to listen to some of the questions and commentary that have come down, and actually I'm going to I'm not going to push through 2.3. I think it was a very useful conversation to have. The intent is not to take the decision away from comments by councillors. It was, for me, it is more to signal that this is something we should be making into a more habitual and process-driven point. So I'm happy to strike out 2.3 and approve items 2.1 and 2.2. Just a couple of other things that came up during the conversation that I always like to put on record. This is linked to policy, so in the very, very detailed pieces, you will see that we are continuing to price on-street over off-street, and because there is, again, Councillor Tyndall will be disappointed at my lack of evidence in the report, there is, if you talk to the environmental health people, they talk about actually the distance from pollution is really very important, to the extent that actually if you are 6 foot tall and you are 3 foot tall, the level that you have exposure to pollutants is different for you. It is really micro on this level, and therefore stopping or encouraging vehicles not to park on the street and to go off street into off-street places rather than hanging around or doing reversing movers is probably a good thing to do. In terms of the pricing levels that we are at, we think we are broadly in line or possibly slightly below similar kind of places. But then before anyone jumps on me and wants to quote Bournemouth, Brighton, Hayling, or any other, that is, again, it is a judgment call that we are making. And we are continuing with the approach of having 3 kind of areas within the city, a pricing regime for city centre, for seafront, and for district shopping. and so district is lower than city centre, for example, but having constant prices within those. And we're doing this because we are trying to balance the consistency, simplicity, the needs of business, visitors, residents in all of these different parking places. So it is something of a compromise and a choice we have to make. Okay, that's it for residential, that's it for parking terrace. We're going to move on to our last item on the agenda, which is the updated Portsmouth Transport Information Plan and Local Transport Delivery Plan 26 to 30. And for that, I'm going to ask Richard Pemberton to take us home.
Thank you, Chair. And yes, last on the agenda, and I'm sorry to say, certainly in terms of the percentage of the report pack, the biggest, but hopefully this will go fairly quickly. The reason for bringing this report and decision forwards, it stems from changes to the local transport funding regime, which have been put in place by the Department for Transport from April this year. It's worth noting that central government and the DFT are by far the largest funder or provider of our transport funding, enabling a lot of our activities. And up until this year, we received transport funding through numerous different funding streams, many dedicated to specific modes of transport or with specific purposes and time restrictions. Some of that funding was provided on a more predictable basis. Some of it was delivered on a year-to-year basis, and we never had clarity on what we were receiving until the year we were in. DFT have now announced a new approach called the Consolidated Local Transport Funding Regime, which rolls up, I believe it's 9 different separate funding streams from the past into a single consolidated grant. And this means, and also it gives a much longer timescale, a much longer runway of funding. We now have confirmation of our revenue funding allocations for the next 3 years and our capital funding allocations for the next 4 years. That's a much longer level of certainty than we've previously had in general. Also, the funding is a lot more flexible than it was in the past, so we are less influenced by modal pots. We can fund schemes more as we see fit, but not entirely. So there's some better flexibility there. There are some complexities associated with this, linked to devolution, and establishment of the Hampshire and Solent Combined Authority is one area of complexity. The first quarterly funding payment has been made direct to PCC, but in future we're expected the payments to go to the Combined Authority because it is gradually assuming local transport authority responsibilities during the transition period we're now in up until May 2028 when a Hampshire and Solent mayor is elected, after which LTA powers pass wholly to the new Combined Authority. Also, some of the other complexities, as a condition of receiving the funding, we're required to produce something called a Local Transport Delivery Plan, or LTDP, which is a DFT-specified template of how the funding will be used. We're required to set out what we intend to allocate to specific projects or wider areas of work, and identify the outcomes which the government has identified which those projects will deliver against. So this LTDP, the decision has been discussions have been had with officers, and the view is that because the Combined Authority will be the recipient of the funding in future, it makes sense that we submit a Portsmouth LTDP as part of a combined Hampshire and Solent submission. So therefore, the first recommendation for this report is requesting approval of the LTDP so that we can then join that with those from Southampton, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight to submit by the 31st of October in a combined form to DFT, meeting their deadline. Members are obviously likely to have an interest in how the proposed funding allocations in the LTDP have actually been determined. And the answer to these questions, we hope, well, we believe, are largely in the updated Local Transport Plan Implementation Plan, which is the second appendix, the second part of the decision requested by this report. So Hopefully you're all aware that as a local transport authority, we are required to publish something called a local transport plan, and the legislation says this should typically be split into two items: a long-term strategy and then an implementation plan outlining the more detailed actions which will deliver to achieve that strategy over a shorter period of time. So our long-term strategy, the Portsmouth Transport Strategy, covers the period 2021 to 2038. It was adopted 5 years ago. It's well established. We've been working towards it for a while now. The implementation plan, we actually took an updated 3-year implementation plan to this decision maker last September. And at that time, we didn't have certainty about funding. We knew that something was likely in terms of consolidated funding, but DfT had not provided any timescales at that point. However, our previous implementation plan was going out of date, so what we published in September, it was a best effort with the available funding at the time, and it included lots of schemes which were identified that we wanted to prioritise for delivery, but couldn't necessarily fund at the time. Obviously, now we've got this runway of funding for the next 3 to 4 years. It's a great opportunity to revisit that plan, and it's enabled us to allocate funding to projects which were previously identified last September as unfunded or only partially funded. So there's one section of the implementation plan, the area around pages 131 to 144 in the document pack. In the last September edition of that plan, there are a lot more projects which are showing as red, not funded, which have become green, now funded, essentially. The other changes we've made from what was previously adopted last September, as we now have funding through till 2029-2030. We have drawn forward the period that the implementation plan covers. We have also updated some of the context, some of the information in that document to reflect the new DfT funding regime. So the main change is ultimately that projects we had previously identified we wanted to deliver are now funded for delivery to go forwards. Because it's an update to an existing plan, there's actually relatively few new projects which are proposed to be funded. The most significant additions actually arise from the recently adopted public transport strategy, which was adopted in February this year. That included a number of actions, a number of initiatives which we identified as being beneficial, but at the time we weren't able to fund. Now we are. This includes funding for development of a joint travel safe officer scheme across Portsmouth and in Gosport, joint with Hampshire County Council, aimed at reducing crime and fear of crime on the public transport network, particularly for women and girls. We also are able to now invest in improved passenger information through rollout of electronic timetable displays, e-paper timetable displays at bus stops across the city. We also have an opportunity to support further growth of our zero-emission bus fleet by investing some additional funding to build on the success of the recent Zebra scheme with First Bus in Portsmouth. The rationale for all of these projects was set out in that new public transport strategy. Other than that, the plan continues investment in established priorities, including highway maintenance, other public transport improvements, electric vehicle infrastructure, technology to squeeze as much as we can out of our very constrained highway network, our programme of local transport improvements in the LTP Capital programme, and also walking and cycling infrastructure. And that's probably one area to focus on briefly. Walking and cycling infrastructure was an area where in last year's LTP annual monitoring report, we evaluated our performance based on evidence and data against the 4 objectives in the local transport plan. Against 3 of the 4 objectives around public transport, around network management, and around air quality, we were performing reasonably well to very well, depending on the area. The one area where we were falling short was around adoption of walking and cycling. Basically, despite lots of natural advantages, Portsmouth is performing no better than the national average for growing walking and cycling. We've got lots of evidence showing that that is due to concerns around safety. Therefore, the proposal is to divert additional funding into improving infrastructure which will support more people to walk for more journeys, perhaps more people to cycle for more journeys. That's one of the larger allocations of funding which we're looking to put, and that should actually help to strengthen something called our active travel capability rating, which at the moment is below where we would like it to be. That in itself translates into, if we can get it up, more funding for the council. So we think by making this investment, it will then bolster future funding decisions made by DFT and Active Travel England. I think it's probably also worth noting that at present we're not aware of, we don't anticipate receiving any additional general purpose transport funding beyond the allocations confirmed here. Certainly for the kind of general purpose pot, we believe this is our lot until 2030. So we think this is the best use of available resources, the kind of a realistic programme using those resources. At the same time, the council continues to promote business cases for some larger strategic transport projects, particularly city centre highway improvements and some bigger sub-regional bus and rail initiatives, which we're working with regional partners and the combined authority to try to promote and fund. If we're successful in generating a business case for those, that would be separate. That would involve separate funding announcements and decisions from DFT. I think the final point to conclude, as highlighted in the Director of Finance's comments, the way the PCC operates, funding commitments have to be finally approved through the Council's annual budget setting process, whilst some allocations for LTP Capital Programme and for highway maintenance have already been approved through the 2026 budget. The other allocations will be brought forward for, hopefully, if they're approved, final confirmation in the 2027 Council budget cycle. So that concludes my summary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Councillor Heaney, you are cogitating?
I'll limit my questions to a couple. I had more than that, but I'll limit it to a couple. I wanted to ask about Active Pompey Neighbourhoods. It says currently resourced only for development of potential schemes because there's no funding for delivery. So are there any potential schemes for development at the moment?
So there are areas being investigated as potential future active Pompey neighbourhoods. There's some feasibility study work ongoing to try to determine which areas might be good candidates, but that's something where it's not currently advanced enough for us to then allocate delivery funding. On the other hand, we have feasibility studies on the shelf for some walking and cycling schemes which could be deliverable within the next 2, 3, 4 years, which it makes more sense for us to allocate funding to, simply because we have more confidence that they could be delivered at the moment.
Would you be willing to let me have a note of those? And outside of the meeting, not now. You know, just a note, so I've got that as a sort of memoir for future reference, because I'll probably forget them if you tell me them now. The one I was going to ask about was Eastern Corridor Active Travel Improvements. It's about the Eastern Road cycleway and improvements. I regularly ask questions about this. Are we any closer to being able to start any work on that, any aspect of that in the near future?
Is there an officer wanting to answer that? Otherwise, I will take a swing.
If you wish to start, I can then fill in what I
will swing first, and let's see what happens. Felicity has walked back into the room and may wish to correct me if I start to go wrong. So, it has been a long-standing issue of trying to knit together the whole of the Eastern Road to have a continuous cycle route in place. There have been legal issues which are not yet resolved in respect to a certain section of it, and therefore consideration is now being given both to how that legal matter can be resolved, but also if there are some other ways in which the matter can be resolved so that we can have a continuous path. Because the value of having a 100% integrated, continuous place is very high, and the money has been sitting there waiting to go. We just haven't been able to go ahead and do it. There have been movements on specific other areas, other crossings along that section, but the critical section by the caravan park, I can't give you clarity as to what's going to happen there because it remains very contested and clouded. Felicity, is there anything you want to add to my equivocation?
No, I think you've covered it there. We are still in discussions, and as you say, we are looking at alternatives, but it's with our legal colleagues at the moment.
If I go slightly further, I think there is recognition that we now need to. We have been hoping that there would be a resolution, a relatively quick and clear resolution, and I think it's now become clear that that isn't going to be the case, and therefore just recently we've started to look at what the alternatives to that would be. I don't have a specific to give you about what that would be.
I understand that, but I mean, I understand the issue has been the boundary with the caravan park and the hedge, and it's about the lease and about an amendment to the lease. And I think they're being less than helpful at the moment, given that this is an important scheme.
I will leave Councillor Heaney's comment there and ask if there are any other questions or comments about this. I recognise there is a great deal of work in putting this together, and actually I'm often politics does raise its head in these matters, and I have often been critical of governments and things they have done. I think the move towards longer term periods and more certainty is actually a very helpful move, and I'd like to kind of a bit above my station to commend the government, but I'll do so anyway for having done it. I could easily move into the next line down and say I wish they'd given us more money to do more things, but that would be perhaps churlish of me. There's many of these things we have to do on a kind of a statutory or a government required basis, and I'm happy to accept the report as it is. There is a lot of information in here about particular schemes and projects and the timings of them in a broad sense, and so I do suggest that people look at it if they really want to look at any particulars. As we move towards LGR and devolution, it is probably the case that our room for manoeuvre starts to narrow, and therefore what you see here is likely to be the majority of the guts about what happens over the next little while. Okay, with that said, I'm going to accept the recommendations in this report and say thank you all very much for coming. I don't think there's anything else left. Any other business from anyone? Thank you very much. And I would only ask Councillor Bosher now to update us on the score in the